Chapter 10.
"Bless this food for our use, and consecrate our lives to thy service," said Uncle Herbert briskly.
Aunt Wellington frowned. She always considered Herbert's graces entirely too short and flippant. A grace, to be a grace in Aunt Wellington's eyes, had to be at least 3 minutes long and uttered in an unearthly tone, between a groan and a chant. As a protest, she kept her head bent a perceptible time after all the rest had been lifted. When she permitted herself to sit upright, she found Valencia looking at her. Ever afterwards, Aunt Wellington averred that she had known from that moment there was something wrong with Valencia. In those queer, slanted eyes of her,
"We always should have known something was not entirely right with eyes like that."
There was an odd gleam of mockery and amusement, as if Valencia were laughing at her. Such a thing was unthinkable, of course. Aunt Wellington at once ceased to think it. Valencia was enjoying herself. She had never enjoyed herself at family reunions before. In social functions, as in childish games, she had only filled in. Her clan had always considered her very dull. She had no parlor tricks, and she had been in the habit of taking refuge from the boredom of family parties in her blue castle, which resulted in an absent-mindedness that increased her reputation for dullness and vacuity.
"She has no social presence whatsoever," Aunt Wellington had decreed once and for all. Nobody dreamed that Valencia was done in their presence merely because she was afraid of them. Now she was no longer afraid of them. The shackles had been stricken off her soul. She was quite prepared to talk if occasion offered. Meanwhile, she was giving herself such freedom of thoughts as she had never dared take before. She had let herself go with wild inner exultation as Uncle Herbert carved the turkey. Uncle Herbert gave Valencia a second look that day. Being a man, he did not know what she had done with her hair, but he thought surprisingly that Doss was not such a bad-looking girl after all, and he put an extra piece of white meat on her plate. "What herb is most injurious to a young lady's beauty?" propounded Uncle Benjamin by way of starting conversation. "Loosen things up a bit," as he would have said.
Valencia, whose duty it was to say, "What?" did not say it. Nobody else did, so Uncle Benjamin, after an expected pause, had to answer,
"Time,"
and felt that his riddle had fallen flat. He looked resentfully at Valencia, who had never failed him before, but Valencia did not even seem to be aware of him. She was gazing around the table, examining relentlessly every one of this depressing assembly of sensible people, and watching their little squirms with detached, amused smile. So these were the people she had always held in reverence and fear. She seemed to see them with new eyes. Big, capable, patronizing, voluble Aunt Mildred, who thought herself the cleverest woman in the clan, her husband a little lower than the angels, and her children wonders. Had not her son, Howard, had been all through teething at 11 months? And could she not tell you the best way to do everything? From cooking mushrooms to picking up a snake? What a bore she was! What ugly moles she had on her face! Cousin Gladys, who was always praising her son, who had died young, and always fighting with her living one, had neuriasis, or what she called neuriasis. It jumped about from one part of her body to another. It was a convenient thing. If anybody wanted her to go somewhere she didn't want to go, she had neuriasis in her legs. And always, if any mental effort was required, she would have neuriasis in her head. You can't think with neuriasis in your head, my dear. What an old humbug you are, thought Valencia impiously. Aunt Isabel. Valencia counted her chins. Aunt Isabel was the critic of the clan. She'd always gone about squashing people flat. More members of it than Valencia were afraid of her. She had, it was conceded, a biting tongue. I wonder what would happen to your face if you ever smiled, speculated Valencia unblushingly. Second cousin Sarah Taylor, with her great, pale, expressionless eyes, who was noted for her variety of pickle recipes and for nothing else. So afraid of saying something indiscreet that she never said anything worth listening to, so proper that she blushed when she saw the advertisement pictures of a corset, and had to put a dress on her Venus de Milo statue, which made it look real tasty. Little cousin Georgiana, not such a bad little soul, but dreary, very. always looking as if she'd just been starched and ironed, always afraid to let herself go. The only thing she really enjoyed was a funeral. You knew where you were with a corpse. Nothing more could happen to it. But while there was life, there was fear. Uncle James, handsome, black, with his sarcastic, trap-like mouth and iron-gray sideburns, whose favorite amusement was to write controversial letters to the Christian Times attacking modernism. Valencia always wondered if he would look as solemn as he had when he was sleeping as he did when he was awake. No wonder his wife died young. Valencia remembered her, a pretty, sensitive thing. Uncle James had denied her everything she wanted and showered her everything she didn't want. He had killed her, quite legally. She had been smothered and starved. Uncle Benjamin, wheezing, pussy-mouthed, with the great pouches under his eyes that held nothing in reverence. Uncle Wellington, long, pallid face, thin, pale yellow hair, one of the fair Sterlings, thin, swooping body, indomitably high forehead with such ugly wrinkles, and about as intelligent as a fish is, thought Valancy. Looks like a cartoon of himself. Aunt Wellington, named Mary, but called by her husband names to distinguish her from Great Aunt Mary. A massive, dignified, permanent woman, splendidly arranged, iron-gray hair, rich, fashionable beaded dress, had her moles removed by electrolysis, which Aunt Mildred thought was a wicked evasion of the purposes of God. Uncle Herbert, with his spiky gray hair, Aunt Alberta, who twisted her mouth so unpleasantly in talking, and had a great reputation for unselfishness because she was always giving up a lot of things she didn't want. Valancy let them off easily in her judgment because she liked them, even if they were, in Mildred's expressive phrase, stupidly good. But she wondered if, for an inscrutable reason, Aunt Alberta had seen fit to tie a black velvet ribbons around each of her chubby arms above the elbow. Then she looked across the table at Olive. Olive, who had been held up to her as a paragon of beauty, behavior, and success as long as she could remember. "Why can't you hold yourself like Olive, Doss? Why can't you stand correctly like Olive, Doss? Why can't you speak prettily like Olive, Doss? Why can't you make an effort, Doss?" Valancy's elfin eyes lost their mocking glitter and became pensive and sorrowful. You could not ignore or disdain Olive. It was quite impossible to deny that she was beautiful and effective, and sometimes she was a little intelligent. Her mouth might be a trifle heavy. She might show her fine, white, regular teeth rather too lavishly when she smiled. But when all was said and done, Olive justified Uncle Benjamin's summing up, "a stunning girl." Yes, Valancy agreed in her heart. Olive was stunning. Rich, golden brown hair, elaborately dressed with a sparkling bandeau holding its glossy puffs in place, large, brilliant blue eyes and the thick silken lashes, face of rose and bare neck of snow, rising above her gown, the great pearl bubbles in her ears, the white gold diamond flame on her long, smooth, waxen finger with its rosy pointed nail, arms of marble gleaming through green chiffon and shadow lace. Valancy suddenly felt thankful that her own scrawny arms were decently swathed in brown silk. Then she resumed her tabulation of Olive's charms. Tall, queenly, confident, everything that Valancy was not. Dimples, too, in chin and cheeks. A woman with dimples always gets her way, thought Valancy, in a recurring spasm of bitterness at fate which denied her even one dimple. Olive was only a year younger than Valancy, though a stranger would have thought there were at least 10 years between them. But nobody had ever dreaded old maidenhood for her. Olive had been surrounded by a crowd of eager beaux since her early teens, just as her mirror was always surrounded by a fringe of cards, photographs, programs, and invitations. At 18, when she had graduated from Havergal College, Olive had been engaged to William Desmond, lawyer in embryo. William Desmond had died, and Olive had mourned him properly for 2 years. When she was 23, she had a hectic affair with Donald Jackson, but Aunt and Uncle Wellington disapproved of that, and in the end Olive dutifully gave him up. Nobody in the Sterling clan, whatever outsiders might say, hinted that she had did so because Donald himself was cooling off. However that might be, Olive's third venture was met with everybody's approval. Cecil Price was clever and handsome and one of Port Lawrence's Prices. Olive had been engaged to him for 3 years. He just graduated in civil engineering, and they were to be married as soon as he landed a contract. Olive's hope chest was full to overflowing with exquisite things, and Olive had already confided to Valencia what her wedding dress would be. Ivory silk draped with lace, white satin court train lined with pale green georgette, heirloom veil of Brussels lace. Valencia knew also, though Olive had not told her, that her bridesmaids were selected, and she was not among them. Valencia had, after a fashion, always been Olive's confidante, perhaps because she was the only girl in the connection who did not bore Olive with returned confidences. Olive always told Valencia all the details of her love affairs, from the days when little boys in school used to persecute her with love letters. Valencia could not comfort herself by thinking of these affairs mythical. Olive really had them. Many men had gone mad over her besides the 3 fortunate ones. "I don't know what those poor idiots see in me that drives them to make double idiots of themselves," Olive was wont to say. Valencia would have liked to say, "I don't either," but truth and diplomacy restrained her. She did know perfectly well. Olive Sterling was one of those girls about whom men did go mad, just as undoubtedly as she, Valencia, was one of those girls whom no man ever looked at twice. And yet, thought Valencia, summing up her with a new and merciless conclusiveness, she is like a dewless morning. There is something lacking. Chapter 11. Meanwhile, the dinner in its early stages was dragging its slow length along true to sterling form. The room was chilly, in spite of the calendar, and Aunt Alberta had the gas log lighted. Everybody in the can envied her those gas logs except Valencia. Glorious open fires blazed in every room of her blue castle when autumnal nights were cold, but she would have frozen to death in it long before she had committed the sacrilege of a gas log. Uncle Herbert made his hearty perennial joke when he helped Aunt Wellington to the cold meat. "Mary, would you have a little lamb?" Aunt Mildred told the same story of once finding a lost ring on a turkey cock. Uncle Benjamin told his favorite prosy tale of how he had been once chased and punished a now famous man for stealing apples. Second cousin Jane described all her sufferings with an ulcerated tooth. Aunt Wellington admired the patterns of Aunt Alberta's silver spoons and lamented the fact that one of her own had been lost. "It spoils the set. I could never get it matched, and it was my wedding present from my dear old Aunt Matilda." Aunt Isabel thought the seasons were changing, and couldn't imagine what would become of our good old-fashioned springs. Cousin Georgiana, as usual, discussed the last funeral and wondered audibly, "Which of us will be the next to pass away?" Cousin Georgiana could never say anything as bluntly as "die." Valencia thought she could tell her, but didn't. Cousin Gladys, likewise as usual, had a grievance. Her visiting nephews had nipped all the buds off her houseplants and chivied her brood of fancy chickens. "Squeeze some of them to actual death, my dear." "Boys will be boys," reminded Uncle Herbert tolerantly. "But they shouldn't be rampant, rambunctious animals," retorted Cousin Gladys, looking around the table for appreciation of her wit. Everybody smiled except Valencia. Cousin Gladys remembered that. A few minutes later, when Ellen Hamilton was being discussed, Cousin Gladys spoke of her as "one of those shy, plain girls who can't get husbands," and glanced significantly at Valencia. Uncle James thought the conversation was sagging to a rather low plane of personal gossip. He tried to elevate it by starting an abstract discussion on the greatest happiness. Everybody was asked to state his or her idea of the greatest happiness. Aunt Mildred thought the greatest happiness, poor woman, was to be a loving and beloved wife and mother. Aunt Wellington thought it would be to travel in Europe. Olive thought it would be to be a great singer like Ch13. Cousin Gladys remarked mournfully that her greatest happiness would be to be free, absolutely free from neuritis. Cousin Georgiana's greatest happiness would be to have her dear dead brother Richard back. And Alberta remarked vaguely that the greatest happiness was to be found in the poetry of life, and hastily gave some directions to her maid to prevent anyone asking her what that meant. Mrs. Frederick said the greatest happiness was to spend her life in loving service for others, and Cousin Sickles and Aunt Isabella agreed with her. Aunt Isabella with a resentful air, as if she thought Mrs. Frederick would have taken the wind out of her sails by saying it first.
We are all too prone, continued Mrs. Frederick, determined not to lose so good an opportunity, to live in selfishness, worldliness, and sin. The other women all felt rebuked for their low ideals, and Uncle James had a conviction that the conversation had been uplifted with a vengeance. The greatest happiness, said Valancy suddenly and distinctly, is to sneeze when you want to. Everybody stared. Nobody felt it was safe to say anything. Was Valancy trying to be funny? It was incredible. Mrs. Frederick, who had been breathing easier since dinner had progressed so far without any outbreak on the part of Valancy, began to tremble again. But she deemed it the better part of prudence to say nothing. Uncle Benjamin was not so prudent. He rashly rushed in where Mrs. Frederick feared to tread. "Toss?" he chuckled. "What's the difference between a young girl and an old maid?" "One is happy and careless, and the other is cappy and hairless," said Valancy. "You have asked that riddle at least 50 times at my recollection, Uncle Ben. Why don't you hunt up some new riddles, if riddle you must? It is such a fatal mistake to try to be funny if you don't succeed." Uncle Benjamin stared foolishly. Never in his life had he, Benjamin Sterling, of Sterlings and Frost, had been spoken to so, and by Valancy of all people. He looked feebly around the table to see what the others thought of it. Everybody was looking rather blank. Poor Mrs. Frederick had shut her eyes. Her lips moved tremblingly, as if she were praying. Perhaps she was. The situation was so unprecedented that nobody knew how to meet it. Valancy went on calmly eating her salad as if nothing out of the usual had occurred. Aunt Alberta, to save her dinner, plunged into an account of how a dog had bitten her recently. Uncle James, to back her up, asked where the dog had bitten her. "Just below the Catholic Church," said Aunt Alberta. At that point, Valancy laughed. Nobody else laughed. What was there to laugh at? "Is that a vital part?" asked Valancy. "What do you mean?" asked bewildered Aunt Alberta, and Mrs. Frederick was almost driven to believe she had served God all her years for naught. Aunt Isabella concluded that it was up to her to suppress Valancy. "Doss, you are horribly thin," she said. "You are all corners. Do you ever try to fatten up a little?" "No," Valancy was not asking quarter or giving it, "but I can tell you where you'll find a beauty parlor in Port Lawrence where they can reduce the number of your chins." "Valancy!" The protest was wrung from Mrs. Frederick. She meant her tone to sound stately and majestic, as usual, but it sounded more like an imploring whine. At least she did not say Doss. "She's feverish," said Cousin Stickles to Uncle Benjamin with an agonized whisper. "We thought she'd seemed feverish for several days." "She's gone dippy, in my opinion," growled Uncle Benjamin. "If not, she ought to be spanked. Yes, spanked." "You can't spank her." Cousin Stickles was much agitated. "She's 29 years old." "So, there's that advantage at least in being 29, said Valancy, whose ears had caught this aside. "Doss," said Uncle Benjamin, "when I am dead, you may say as you please. As long as I am alive, I demand to be treated with respect." "Oh, but you know we're all dead," said Valancy. "The whole Sterling clan. Some of us are buried, and some of us aren't, yet. That's the only difference." "Doss," said Uncle Benjamin, thinking it might cow Valancy. "Do you remember the time you stole raspberry jam?"
Valancy flushed scarlet, with suppressed laughter, not shame. She had been sure Uncle Benjamin would drag up that jam in somehow. "Of course I do," she said. "It was good jam. I've always been sorry I hadn't had time to eat more of it before you found me. Oh, look at Aunt Isabel's profile on the wall. Did you ever see anything so funny?" Everybody looked, including Aunt Isabel herself, which, of course, destroyed it. But Uncle Herbert said kindly, I wouldn't eat any more if I were you, Doss. It isn't that I grudge it, but don't you think it would be a little better for yourself? Your stomach seems a little out of order." "Don't worry about my stomach, old dear," said Valancy. "It's all right. I'm going to keep right on eating. It's so seldom I get the chance of a satisfying meal." It was the first time anyone had been called "old dear" in Deerwood. The Sterlings thought Valancy had invented the phrase, and they were afraid of her from that moment. There was something so uncanny about the expression. But in poor Mrs. Frederick's opinion, the reference to a satisfying meal was the worst thing Valancy had said yet. Valancy had always been a disappointment to her. Now she was a disgrace. She thought she would have to get up and go away from the table, yet she dared not leave Valencia there. Aunt Alberta's maid came in and removed the salad plates and bring in dessert. It was a welcome diversion. Everybody brightened up with the determination to ignore Valencia and talk as if she weren't there. Uncle Wellington mentioned Barney Snipe. Eventually, somebody did mention Barney Snipe at every Sterling function, Valencia reflected. Whatever he was an individual that could not be ignored. She resigned herself to listen. There was a subtle fascination in the subject for her, though she had not yet faced this fact. She could feel her pulse beating in her fingertips. Of course, they abused him. Nobody ever had a good word to say of Barney Snipe. All the old wild tales canvassed. The defaulting, cashier, counterfeiter, infidel, murderer, and hiding legends were thrashed out. Uncle Wellington was very indignant that such a creature should be allowed to exist at all in the neighborhood of Deerwood. He didn't know what the police at Port Lawrence were thinking of. Everybody would be murdered in their beds some night. It was a shame that he should be allowed to be at large after all he'd done. "What has he done?" asked Valencia suddenly. Uncle Wellington stared at her, forgetting she was to be ignored. "Done? Done? He's done everything!" "What has he done?" repeated Valencia inexplorably. "What do you know that he has done? You're always running him down. But what has ever been proven against him?" "I don't argue with women," said Uncle Wellington. "When a man hides himself up there on an island in Muskoka year in and year out, and nobody can find where he comes from or how he lives or what he does there, that's proof enough. Find a mystery and you find a crime." "And the very idea of a man named Snipe," said second cousin Sarah. "Why, the name itself is enough to condemn him." "I wouldn't like to meet him in a dark lane," shivered cousin Georgiana. "What do you suppose he would do to you?" asked Valencia. "Murder me," said cousin Georgiana solemnly. "Just for the fun of it?" suggested Valencia. "Exactly," said cousin Georgiana unsuspiciously. "When there's so much smoke, there must be a fire. I was afraid he was a criminal when he came at first. I felt he had something to hide. I am not often mistaken in my intuitions." "Criminal? Of course he's a criminal," said Uncle Wellington. "Nobody doubts it," glaring at Valencia. "Why, they say he served a term in the penitentiary for embezzlement, and I don't doubt it. They say he's in there with that gang that perpetrated all those bank robberies around the country." "Who says?" asked Valencia. Uncle Wellington nodded his ugly forehead at her. What had gotten into this confounded girl anyway? He ignored the subject. "He has the identical look of a jailbird," snapped Uncle Benjamin. "I noticed the first time I saw him. A fellow by the hand of nature marked, 'Quote inside do the deed of shame,'" declaimed Uncle James. He looked enormously pleased over managing to work in that quotation at last. He had been waiting all his life for the chance. "One of his eyebrows has an arch and the other is a triangle," said Valencia. "Is that why you think him so villainous?" Uncle James lifted his eyebrows. Generally, when Uncle James lifted his eyebrows, the world came to an end. This time it continued to function. "How do you know his eyebrows so well, Doss?" asked Olive a trifle maliciously. Such a remark would have covered Valencia with confusion 2 weeks ago, and Olive knew it. "Yes, how?" demanded Aunt Wellington. "I've seen him twice, and I looked at him closely," said Valencia composedly. "I thought his face the most interesting one I've ever saw." "There's no doubt there's something fishy in that creature's past life," said Olive, who had begun to think she was decidedly out of the conversation, which had centered so amazingly around Valencia. "But he can hardly be guilty of everything he's been accused of, you know." Valencia felt annoyed with Olive. Why should she speak up, even in this qualified defense of Barney Snipe? What had she to do with him? For that matter, what had Valencia? But Valencia did not ask herself this question. "They say he keeps dozens of cats up in that hut back in Mistowas," said second cousin Sarah Taylor, by way of appearing not quite ignorant of him. Cats. That sounded quite alluring to Valencia in the plural. She pictured an island in Miskota haunted by pussies. "That alone shows there's something wrong with him," decreed Aunt Isabel. "People who don't like cats," said Valencia, attacking her dessert with relish, "always seem to think there's some particular virtue in not liking them." "That man hasn't a friend except Roaring Abel,"
said Uncle Wellington, and if Roaring Abel had kept away from them as everybody else did, it would have been better for some members of his family. Uncle Wellington's rather lame conclusion was due to a marital glance from Aunt Wellington reminding him of what he'd almost forgotten, that there were girls at the table. "If you mean," said Valencia passionately, "that Barney Smythe is the father of Cecil Gay's child, he isn't. It is a wicked lie." In spite of her indignation, Valencia was hugely amused at the expression on the faces around the festive table. She had not seen anything like it since a day 17 years ago, when at Cousin Gail's thimble party they discovered that she had gotten something in her head at school. Lice in her head. Valencia was done with euphemisms. Poor Mrs. Frederick was almost in a state of collapse. She had believed, or pretended to believe, that Valencia still supposed children were to be found in parsley beds. "Hush, hush!" implored Cousin Sickles. "I don't mean to hush," said Valencia perversely. "I've hushed all my life. I'll scream if I want to. Don't make me want to, and stop talking nonsense about Barney Smythe." Valencia didn't expect to understand her own indignation. What did Barney Smythe's imputed crimes and misdemeanors matter to her, and why, out of all of them, did it seem most intolerable that she should have been poor, pitiful little Cecil Gay's false lover? For it did seem intolerable to her. She did not mind when they called him a thief, or a counterfeit, and a jailbird, but she could not endure to think that he had loved and ruined Cecily Gay. She recalled his face on the 2 occasions of their chance meetings, his twisted, enigmatic, engaging smile, his twinkle, his thin, sensitive, almost aesthetic lips, his general air of daredevilry. A man with such a smile and lips might have murdered or stolen, but he could not have betrayed. She suddenly hated everyone who said it or believed it of him. "When I was a young girl, I never thought or spoke about such matters, Dawes," said Aunt Wellington crushingly. "But I am not a young girl," retorted Valencia, uncrushed. "Aren't you always rubbing that into me? And you are all evil-minded, senseless gossips. Can't you leave poor Cissy Gay alone? She's dying. Whatever she did, God or the devil has punished her for it enough. You don't need to take a hand in it, too. As for Barney Smythe, the only crime he's been guilty of is living to himself and minding his own business. He can, it seems, get along without you, which is an unpardonable sin, of course, in your little snobocracy." Valencia coined that concluding word suddenly, and it felt like it was an inspiration. That was exactly what they were, and not one of them was fit to mend another. "Valencia, your father would turn in his grave if he could hear you," said Mrs. Frederick. "I dare say he would like that for a change," said Valencia brazenly. "Doss," said Uncle James heavily, "the 10 Commandments are still fairly up to date, especially the 5th. Have you forgotten that?" "No," said Valencia, "but I thought you had, especially the 9th. Have you ever thought, Uncle James, how dull life would be without the 10 Commandments? It is only when things are forbidden that they become fascinating." But her excitement had been too much for her. She knew, by certain unmistakable warnings, that one of her attacks of pain was coming on. It must not find her here. She rose from her chair. "I am going home now. I only came for dinner, and it was very good, Aunt Alberta, though your salad dressing is not salt enough, and a dash of cayenne would improve it." None of the flabbergasted silver wedding guests could think of anything to say until the long gate clanged behind Valencia in the dusk. Then, "She's feverish. I've said it right along, she's feverish," bemoaned Cousin Stickles. Uncle Benjamin pushed his pudgy left hand fiercely with his pudgy right. "She's dippy, I tell you, she's gone dippy," he snorted angrily. "That's all there is to it, clean dippy." "Oh, Benjamin," said Cousin Georgiana soothingly, "don't condemn her too rashly. We must remember what dear old Shakespeare says, that charity thinketh no evil." "Charity? Poppycock!" snorted Uncle Benjamin. "I've never heard a young woman talk of such things in my life as she did. Talking about things she ought to be ashamed to think of, less mention. Blaspheming, insulting us. What she wants is a generous dose of spanking, and I'd like to be the one to administer it." Uncle Benjamin gulped down half a cup of scalding coffee. "Do you suppose the mumps could work on a person that way?" wailed Cousin Stickles. "I opened an umbrella on the house yesterday,"
sniffed Cousin Georgiana. "I knew it betokened some misfortune." "Have you ever tried to find out if she has a temperature?" asked Cousin Mildred. "She won't let Amelia put the thermometer under her tongue," whispered Cousin Stickles. Mrs. Frederick was openly in tears. All her defenses were down. "Let me tell you," she sobbed, "that Valencia has been acting strange for over 2 weeks now. She hasn't been a bit like herself, Christine could tell you. I have hoped against hope that it was only one of her colds coming on, but it must be something worse." "This is bringing on my neuritis again," said Cousin Gladys, bringing her hand to her head. "Don't cry, Amelia," said Herbert kindly, pulling nervously at his spiking gray hair. He hated family ructions. Very inconsiderate of Doss to start one at his silver wedding. Who would have supposed she had it in her? "You'll have to take her to a doctor. This may be only a brainstorm. There are such things as brainstorms nowadays, aren't there?" I suggested consulting a doctor to her yesterday," moaned Mrs. Frederick, "and she said she wouldn't go to a doctor, wouldn't. Oh, surely I have had trouble enough." "And she won't take Redfern's bitters," said Cousin Stickle. "Or anything," said Mrs. Frederick. "And she's determined to go to Presbyterian church," said Cousin Stickles, repressing, however much to her credit, the story of the banister. "That proves she's dippy," growled Uncle Benjamin. "I noticed something strange about her the minute she came in today. I noticed it before today." Uncle Benjamin was thinking of Mirazh. "Everything she said today showed an unbalanced mind. That question, was it a vital part? Was there any sense at all in that remark? None whatsoever. There never was anything like that in the Sterlings. It must come from the Wanstabaras." Poor Mrs. Frederick was too crushed to be indignant. "I've never heard of anything like that in the Wanstabaras," she sobbed. "Your father was odd enough," said Uncle Benjamin. "Poor Pa was particular," admitted Miss Frederick tearfully, "but his mind was never affected." "He talked all his life exactly as Valencia did today," retorted Uncle Benjamin, "and he believed his own great-grandfather was born over again. I've heard him say it. Don't tell me that a man who believed a thing like that ever came to his right senses. Come, Amelia, stop sniffling. Of course Doss has made a terrible exposition of herself today, but she's not responsible. Old maids are apt to fly off on a tangent like that. If she had been married when she should have been, she wouldn't have gotten like this." "Nobody wanted to marry her," said Mrs. Frederick, who felt somehow Uncle Benjamin was blaming her. "Well, fortunately, there's no outsider here," snapped Uncle Benjamin. "We may have to keep it in the family yet. We'll take her over to see Dr. Marsh tomorrow. I know how to deal with pig-headed people. Won't that be best, James?" "We must have medical advice, certainly," agreed Uncle James. "Well, that's settled. In the meantime, Amelia, act as if nothing has happened and keep an eye on her. Don't let her be alone. Above all, don't let her sleep alone." Renewed whimpers from Mrs. Frederick. "I can't help it. The night before last I suggested she better have Christine sleep with her, and she positively refused and locked her door. Oh, you don't know how she's changed. She won't work, at least she won't sew. She does her usual housework, of course, but she won't sweep the parlor in the morning, even though we always sweep it on Thursdays. She said she'll wait until it was dirty. 'Would you rather sweep a dirty room than a clean one?' I asked her, and she said, 'Of course, I'd see something for my labor then.' Think of it." Uncle Benjamin thought of it. "The jar of potpourri," Cousin Stickles pronounced it as it was spelled, "has disappeared from her room. I found it on pieces in the next lot. She won't tell us what happened to it." "I should have never dreamed it of Doss," said Uncle Herbert. "She always seemed such a quiet, sensible girl, a bit backward, but sensible." "The only thing you can be sure of in this world is the multiplication table," said Uncle James, feeling cleverer than ever. "Well, let's cheer up," suggested Uncle Benjamin. "Why are chorus girls like fine stock racers?" "Why?" asked Cousin Stickles, since it had to be asked and Valencia wasn't there to ask. "They like to exhibit calves," chuckled Uncle Benjamin. Cousin Stickles thought Uncle Benjamin was a little indelicate, before Olive too, but then, he was a man. Uncle Herbert was thinking that things were rather dull now that Doss was gone. Chapter 12. Valencia hurried home through the faint blue twilight, hurried too fast perhaps. The attack she had when she thankfully reached the shelter of her own room was the worst yet. It was verily very bad. She might die in one of these spells. It could be dreadful to die in such pain. Perhaps this was death. Valencia felt pitifully alone. When she could think at all, she wondered what it would be like to have someone who could really sympathize, someone who really cared, just to hold her hand tight, if nothing else. Someone to say to her, "Yes, I know, it's dreadful. Be brave, you'll be better soon." Not someone merely fussy and alarmed. Not her mother or her cousin Stickles. Why did the thought of Barney Smythe come into her mind? Why did she feel suddenly, in the midst of this hideous, loneliest pain, that he would be sympathetic, sorry for anyone that was suffering? Why did he seem to her like an old, well-known friend? Was it because she had defended him, standing up to her family for him? She was so bad at first that she could not even get herself a dose of Dr. Trent's prescription. But eventually she managed it, and soon after relief came. The pain left her, and she was lying on the bed, spent, exhausted, in cold perspiration. Oh, that had been horrible! She could not endure many more attacks like that. One didn't mind dying if dying could be instant and painless. To be hurt so in dying. Suddenly she found herself laughing. That dinner had been fun, and it had been so simple. She merely said the things she always thought. Their faces! Uncle Benjamin! Poor, flabbergasted Uncle Benjamin! Valencia felt quite sure he was to make a new will that very night. Olive would get Valancia's share of his fat hoard. Olive always got Valancia's share of everything. Remember the dust pile. To laugh at her clan, as she'd always wanted to laugh, was all the satisfaction she could get out of life now. But she thought it was rather pitiful that it should be so. Might she not pity herself a little when nobody else did? Valencia got up and went to her window. The moist, beautiful wind blowing across the groves of the young-leaf wild trees touched her face with the caress of a wise, tender old friend. The Lombardis in Mrs. Tredrow's lawn, off to the left, Valencia could just see them between the stable and the old carriage shop, were in a dark purple silhouette against a clear sky, and there was a milk-white pulsating star just over one of them, like a living pearl on silver-green lake. Far beyond the station were a shadowy, purple-hooded woods around Lake Mistawus. A faint, flimsy mist hung over them, and just above was a faint young crescent. Valencia looked it over with her thin left shoulder. "I wish," she said whimsically, "that I might have one little dust pile before I die." Chapter 13. Uncle Benjamin found he had reckoned without his host when he promised so airily to take Valencia to a doctor. Valencia would not go. Valencia laughed at his face. "Why on earth should I go to Dr. Marsh? There's nothing the matter with my mind. Though all think I've suddenly gone crazy. Well, I haven't. I've simply grown tired of living to please other people, and have decided to please myself. It will give you something to talk about, besides my stealing raspberry jam. So there's that." "Doss," said Uncle Benjamin solemnly and helplessly, "you are not like yourself." "Who am I like, then?" asked Valencia. Uncle Benjamin was rather poised. "Your grandfather Wansborough," he answered desperately. "Thanks." Valencia looked pleased. "That's a real compliment. I remember Grandfather Wansborough. He is one of the few human beings I have known, almost the only one. Now it is of no use to scold or entreat or command Uncle Benjamin, or to exchange anguished glances with Mother and Cousin Stickles. I'm not going to any doctor, and if you bring a doctor here I won't see him. What are you going to do about it?" What indeed? It was not simply seemly or even possible to hale Valencia doctorwards by physical force, and in no other way could it be done, seemingly. Her mother's tears and implored treaties availed not. "Don't worry, Mother," said Valencia lightly but quite respectfully. "It isn't like I'll do anything very terrible. I just mean to have a little fun." "Fun!" Mrs. Frederick uttered the word as if Valencia had said she was going to have a little tuberculosis. Olive, sent by her mother to see if she had any influence over Valencia, came away with flushed cheeks and angry eyes. She told her mother that nothing could be done with Valencia after she, Olive, had talked to her just like her sister Tenderly and wisely, all Valencia had said, narrowing her funny eyes to mere slips, was, "I don't show my gums when I laugh." More as if she were talking to herself rather than to me. Indeed, Mother, all the time I was talking to her, she gave me the impression of not really listening. And that wasn't all. When I finally decided that what I was saying had no influence over her, I begged her, when Cecil came the next week, not to say anything queer before him at least. Mother, what do you think she said?
"Oh, I'm sure I can't imagine," groaned Aunt Wellington, prepared for anything.
She said, "I'd rather like to shock Cecil. His mouth is too red for a man." Mother, I can never have the same feeling to Valencia again.
"Her mind is effective, Olive," said Aunt Wellington solemnly. "You must not hold her responsible for what she says." When Aunt Wellington told Mrs. Frederick what Valencia had said to Olive, Mrs. Frederick wanted Valencia to apologize.
"You made me apologize 15 years ago for something I didn't do," said Valencia. "That whole apology will do for now."
Another solemn family conclave was held. They were all there except for Cousin Gladys, who had been suffering such tortured neuritis in her head, ever since poor Doss went queer, that she couldn't undertake any responsibility. They decided, that is, they accepted a fact that was thrust into their faces, that the wisest thing to do was to leave Valencia alone for a while. "Give her head," as Uncle Benjamin expressed it. "Keep a careful eye on her, but let her pretty much alone." And the terms of watchful waiting had not been invented then, but it was practically the policy Valencia's destructive relatives decided to follow. "We must be guided by developments," said Uncle Benjamin. "It is," solemnly, "easier to scramble eggs than unscramble them. Of course, if she becomes violent—" Uncle James consulted Dr. Ambrose Marsh. Dr. Ambrose Marsh approved their decision. He pointed out to an irate Uncle James, who would like to have locked Valencia up somewhere out of hand, that if Valencia had not, as of yet, really done or said anything that could be construed as proof of lunacy, and without proof you could not lock people up in this degenerate age. Nothing that Uncle James had reported seemed very alarming to Dr. Marsh, who had put up his hands to conceal a smile several times. But then he himself was not a Sterling, and he knew very little about the old Valencia. Uncle James stalked out and drove back to Deerwood, thinking that Ambrose Marsh wasn't much of a doctor after all, and that Adelaide Sterling might have done better for herself.